October 1944. A young American pilot sits in a French farmhouse, hands still trembling from what just happened. His P-51 Mustang lies scattered across a hillside 15 miles away. He has no identification papers, he burned them after ejecting. No uniform, he's wearing borrowed civilian clothes that don't quite fit. And absolutely no business being alive. 24 hours ago, Captain Chuck Yeager was dead. The Luftwaffe had seen to that. His aircraft had been shot to pieces over occupied France, forcing him to bail out deep behind enemy lines. Standard protocol was clear. Downed pilots who couldn't immediately return to Allied territory were done flying for the war. Too much risk, they'd be captured and interrogated. Too much classified knowledge in their heads about tactics, aircraft performance, radar systems. Dead pilots don't fly again. That's just how it worked. But Chuck Yeager wasn't particularly interested in following protocols. And over the next 6 months, this West Virginia boy with an 8th grade education would compile a combat record so statistically improbable that if you saw it in a movie, you'd call it Hollywood nonsense. 5 kills in a single day, becoming an ace in a single mission, achieving ace status twice, once before being shot down, once after escaping back to England, then shooting down one of Nazi Germany's most advanced jet fighters while flying a propeller-driven aircraft that was technically slower. This is the story of a pilot who died, came back, and became a legend. A man who would later break the sound barrier and redefine what humans believed possible in the sky. But before all that, he had to survive occupied France, cross the Pyrenees Mountains in winter, convince the military to let him fly again against direct orders, and then prove that sometimes the difference between possible and impossible is just a West Virginia boy who's too stubborn to know the difference. This is Chuck Yeager's war. Charles Elwood Yeager was born February 13, 1923 in Myra, West Virginia, a town so small it barely registered on maps. His family moved to Hamlin when he was young, another coal country town where opportunities were limited and futures were often predetermined by geography and circumstance. The Appalachian region during the Depression offered few paths forward. You worked the mines, worked the land, or found some way out. Education past 8th grade was a luxury most families couldn't afford. Chuck's father was a driller in the natural gas fields. Hard, dangerous work that paid just enough to keep a family fed. Chuck grew up hunting in the West Virginia hills, learning to shoot with the kind of instinctive accuracy that comes from necessity rather than sport. When you're hunting to supplement the family table, you don't waste ammunition. You learn to judge distance, account for wind, anticipate movement. You develop what locals called good eyes, the ability to spot small details at distance, to see what others missed. He was mechanically inclined in the way of people who grow up in places where you fix things yourself, because professionals are 50 miles away and unaffordable anyway. Engines, tools, machinery, he understood them intuitively, could take them apart and reassemble them, diagnose problems by sound and feel. These weren't skills anyone considered particularly valuable in 1941. They were just survival traits of rural Appalachia. But they would prove to be precisely the skills that matter when you're 6 miles above Germany in a vibrating metal tube with someone trying to kill you. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Chuck was 18 working as a mechanic. The military draft was inevitable. Rather than wait, he enlisted in the Army Air Forces in September 1941, 3 months before the attack. His reasoning was characteristically practical. Better to choose your branch than have it chosen for you. The Army Air Forces in 1941 was expanding rapidly, but still relatively selective. Chuck entered as an enlisted man. Aircraft mechanic was the expected assignment given his background. The path to becoming a pilot typically required college education, officer training, credentials Chuck simply didn't have. But the Air Forces was learning that war operates on different rules than peacetime. Educational credentials don't keep you alive in combat. Instinct, reflexes, spatial awareness, mechanical understanding. These qualities matter more than degrees when the shooting starts. The flying sergeant program was created partly out of necessity. Officer pilots were being killed faster than the training pipeline could replace them, but also from the recognition that flying ability wasn't necessarily correlated with formal education. They started selecting enlisted men who showed aptitude, offering them flight training while maintaining their enlisted status. Chuck volunteered immediately. The selection process for the Flying Sergeant program was rigorous and impersonal. Physical fitness, vision tests, coordination assessments, psychological evaluations. The military was looking for specific measurable traits: excellent eyesight, superior hand-eye coordination, quick reaction times, spatial reasoning ability, stress tolerance. Chuck's vision tested at 2010 better than perfect. He could see aircraft at distances that other pilots couldn't, identify aircraft types before anyone else confirmed them. His hand-eye coordination scored in the highest percentiles. The mechanical aptitude he'd developed, fixing gas field equipment, translated directly to understanding aircraft systems. But the real discovery came when he actually started flying. Some skills can be taught through repetition and discipline. Formation flying, navigation, radio procedures, emergency protocols, these are learnable. But there's another category of flying ability that instructors recognized but couldn't quite define. Some students simply had an instinctive feel for the aircraft, could sense what the plane was doing and about to do, could make corrections before instruments confirmed the need. Chuck had that quality in unusual degree. He described it later as understanding what the airplane wanted to do. Not what the manual said it should do, but what the specific aircraft, with its particular engine, at this specific weight, in these atmospheric conditions, was actually doing. He flew by feel as much as by instrument, sensing airflow changes, engine rhythm variations, control surface feedback. His instructors noted it in their reports: natural talent, exceptional situational awareness, unusually smooth control inputs. He wasn't the most technically polished student. His formal education showed in academic subjects, but in the actual aircraft, he demonstrated abilities that couldn't be taught. One instructor wrote, "Yeager has an instinctive understanding of three-dimensional maneuvering that I've rarely encountered. He doesn't think through aerobatic maneuvers, he feels them. This could make him either an exceptional pilot or a dangerous one, depending on whether we can teach him discipline to match the intuition." The discipline came through training, but the intuition, that was something he'd brought with him from West Virginia. The same visual acuity that let him spot squirrels in forest canopy at 100 yards, now let him spot enemy aircraft before anyone else. The same hand-eye coordination that made him a natural shot now translated to gunnery. The same mechanical understanding that helped him repair gas field equipment now helped him extract maximum performance from aircraft engines. By the time Chuck completed training and received his sergeant's wings in March 1943, his instructors recognized they had something unusual, not just a competent pilot, but someone with the potential to be exceptional in combat conditions where split-second decisions and instinctive reactions meant the difference between living and dying. He was assigned to the 363rd Fighter Squadron, 57th Fighter Group, flying P-39 Airacobras initially, adequate aircraft but not what fighter pilots wanted. The assignment everyone wanted was P-51 Mustangs, but those went to more experienced pilots. Chuck would have to prove himself first. The 357th Fighter Group arrived in England in late 1943, based at RAF Leiston in Suffolk. The reality of combat operations was sobering. Fighter groups were losing pilots faster than replacements arrived. The life expectancy of new pilots, measured from first combat mission to death or serious injury, was being measured in weeks. The veterans who'd survived more than a dozen missions had a particular look: exhausted, older than their years, quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful but rather suggested they'd stopped expecting to survive and had made peace with it. They didn't socialize much with new pilots. The emotional cost of befriending someone who'd be dead in 2 weeks was too high. Chuck learned the statistics quickly. In fighter combat, most pilots who were going to die did so in their first 5 missions. Inexperience was lethal. You'd make a mistake, fly predictable patterns, fixate on a target while someone else lined up on you, mismanage fuel, get disoriented in clouds, and that mistake would kill you. The pilots who survived those first missions developed what was called situational awareness and the ability to track multiple aircraft simultaneously, maintain orientation in 3-dimensional space during violent maneuvering, anticipate what enemies would do based on their positions and energy states. Some pilots never developed it. They were competent in training but couldn't process the chaos of actual combat. They died confused, never quite understanding how the enemy got behind them. Chuck's first combat mission was March 4, 1944, an escort mission for bombers attacking targets in Germany. His job was simple: stay in formation, protect the bombers, follow your flight leader, don't do anything stupid. It was simultaneously terrifying and anticlimactic. Flak bursts created black clouds that the formation flew through, each one a near-miss death sentence. German fighters appeared at distance but didn't engage his particular formation. He spent 3 hours at high altitude, cold seeping through his flight suit, oxygen mask uncomfortable, neck cramping from constantly scanning the sky, and fired no shots. He landed back at Leaston having accomplished nothing memorable but having survived. That alone put him ahead of one pilot from another squadron who hadn't returned. The second mission was similar. Then the third. He was learning the rhythm of combat operations. Pre-flight briefings with intelligence updates on expected enemy resistance, the physical discomfort of high-altitude flight in unpressurized cockpits, the constant scanning for enemy aircraft, the sudden bursts of adrenaline when someone called out contacts, the relief of landing safely, the numb acceptance when someone else's aircraft didn't return. By his fifth mission, Chuck had fired his guns in anger exactly once. A long-range shot at a German fighter that had disengaged before he could close the distance. No kills, no damage inflicted, no glory, just survival. But he was learning, watching how German pilots maneuvered, understanding their tactics, recognizing the patterns of engagement and disengagement. He was developing that crucial situational awareness, learning to process the chaos, starting to anticipate rather than just react. On his seventh mission, March 5, 1944, everything changed. March 5, 1944 began as another routine escort mission, though routine in this context meant flying hundreds of miles into hostile territory surrounded by people trying to kill you. The 357th Fighter Group was assigned to escort B-17 bombers attacking targets in the Bordeaux region of southern France. Chuck was flying P-51B, Mustang number 436763, nicknamed Glamorous Glenn after his girlfriend Glennis back home. He was part of a 4-aircraft flight, maintaining position in the bomber stream, scanning constantly for German interceptors. The mission proceeded according to plan through the outbound leg. The bombers reached their targets and dropped their loads. Fighter opposition had been moderate, a few encounters but nothing sustained. They were on the return leg still over occupied France when Chuck spotted something. A Focke-Wulf Fu-190, one of the Luftwaffe's best fighters, maneuvering below them. His flight leader called it out and they dove to engage. This was the moment every fighter pilot both craved and feared. All the training, all the preparation, compressed into the next 60 seconds. Chuck positioned his aircraft, calculated lead and deflection, closed to effective range, and fired. His first combat kill. The FW-190 took hits, began trailing smoke, fell away. Chuck watched long enough to confirm the kill, then pulled up to regain altitude and rejoin his formation. That's when his aircraft shuddered with impacts. Another FW-190, one he hadn't seen, had positioned perfectly. The German pilot had done exactly what Chuck had just done, waited for an enemy to fixate on a target, then struck when they were most vulnerable. Cannon shells ripped through the Mustang's airframe. Coolant lines ruptured. The engine began overheating immediately. Chuck felt the aircraft's handling change as control surfaces took damage. His first thought was getting back to England. But the math was immediately clear. Severely damaged aircraft, still over occupied France, coolant temperature climbing toward catastrophic engine failure. He had maybe 2 minutes before the engine seized or caught fire. The training took over. Maintain best glide speed. Look for forced landing options, prepare to bail out if necessary. But every second he stayed with the aircraft was another mile closer to Allied territory. He nursed it as far as he could, watching the temperature gauge climb into the red, feeling the engine roughness increase, knowing he was pushing his luck. The engine made the decision for him. Temperature exceeded limits. He could smell hot metal and burning oil. If he stayed with the aircraft much longer, it would either explode or become uncontrollable. Chuck rolled the aircraft inverted and dropped out at about 20,000 feet somewhere over the Bordeaux region. The slipstream caught him, tumbling him violently. He waited, falling too fast for German fighters to track easily, but waiting long enough that he'd be lower when his parachute deployed, making him harder to spot from the ground. At about 10,000 feet, he pulled the ripcord. The parachute deployed hard, jerking him violently but functioning correctly. He was now completely exposed, drifting slowly to earth in broad daylight over occupied France, hoping no German troops had observed his descent. The landing was rough. He hit in a wooded area, crashed through tree branches and slammed into the ground hard enough to momentarily knock the wind out of him. He lay still for a few moments, assessing damage. Nothing broken. Bruised and battered, but functional. Standard protocol kicked in immediately. Gather the parachute so it couldn't be spotted from distance. Bury it if possible. Destroy anything that identified you as American military. Dog tags, patches, any documents. Germans treated captured pilots as prisoners of war under Geneva Convention rules, but only if you were clearly identified as military. Pilots in civilian clothes could be treated as spies. Chuck buried his parachute, stripped off his flight suit, and stood in the French forest wearing just his uniform underneath. He had a basic escape kit: compass, some currency, emergency rations, a map. Nothing that would help him cross hundreds of miles of occupied territory to reach Allied lines. He was officially dead, or at least missing. His squadron wouldn't know if he'd been captured, killed on impact, or evaded successfully. They'd file him as MIA, missing in action, and wait for confirmation one way or another. Chuck Yeager's war, as far as the Army Air Forces knew, was over, but Chuck hadn't received that memo. The first 48 hours were the most dangerous. German troops would be actively searching for downed airmen, questioning locals, checking farms and villages. Chuck needed to find help quickly or evade until the search intensity decreased. He had basic survival training: travel at night, avoid roads and villages, find water sources, move generally southwest toward Spain and neutral territory, but the reality was daunting. He was in rural France with limited French language ability, no papers, and every person he encountered could either save him or turn him over to the Germans. On his second day, hiding in a barn, a French farmer discovered him. This moment could go either way. Some French civilians cooperated with German occupation forces, either out of genuine collaboration or simple survival pragmatism. Others risked their lives helping Allied airmen escape. Chuck had no way to know which category this farmer fell into. The farmer looked at him for a long moment, taking in the obvious signs: young, foreign, hiding in a barn, wrong clothes for a farm worker. The assessment took seconds. The farmer gave a slight nod and walked away without speaking. An hour later, he returned with food, water, and clothing that actually fit. Still without much conversation, the farmer's English was minimal. Chuck's French worse, but the message was clear: stay hidden. Someone will come. That someone arrived 2 days later. A member of the French resistance, a network of civilians conducting sabotage operations and helping Allied personnel escape occupied territory. The resistance operated through cells with minimal knowledge of other cells. If captured and tortured, you couldn't reveal what you didn't know. The young woman, Chuck never learned her real name. Only a code designation, spoke some English. Her instructions were clear: you follow exactly what we tell you when we tell you. You ask no questions. You trust completely or you're on your own. The escape line had been operating for months, moving downed airmen through a network of safe houses, eventually getting them across the Pyrenees into Spain. It was dangerous work. Germans had infiltrated some escape lines, capturing both the airmen and the resistance members helping them. The penalty for aiding enemy personnel was execution, often of entire families to discourage others. Yet these people, farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, ordinary French civilians, risked everything to help strangers. Chuck was moved from location to location over the next several weeks, never staying more than a few days in one place. Each safe house represented a family gambling their lives. He saw the fear in their eyes, the tension when German patrols passed nearby, the relief when he moved on to the next location in the chain. At one farmhouse, he stayed with a family that included 2 young children. The father spoke some English and explained their reasoning. The Germans are in our country. They tell us what to do, take our food, make us afraid in our own homes. Helping you is helping France. If they catch us, they catch us. But we will not stop being French because Germans occupy our land. The journey took on a rhythm. Travel at night, hide during day, minimal conversation, constant alertness. Chuck was grouped with other downed Allied airmen at various points, pilots and bomber crew members, all making the same desperate journey. One was a B-17 bombardier who'd been shot down 3 weeks earlier. Another was a RAF Spitfire pilot, shot down over France on a fighter sweep. They shared information, rumors, fears. Most expected they'd be captured before reaching Spain. The odds weren't good. The resistance taught them phrases in French, how to act less obviously American, how to respond if stopped by German patrols. Chuck's West Virginia accent was a liability, unmistakably American even with limited French vocabulary. They taught him to simply stay silent if Germans were nearby, to pretend to be a deaf-mute laborer if directly confronted. One night, hidden in a cellar while German troops searched the building above, Chuck understood viscerally what courage these French civilians demonstrated daily. He could run, fight, try to escape if discovered. These families had nowhere to run. Their country was occupied, their lives constrained, their choices limited to cooperation or resistance, both dangerous in different ways. After nearly 4 weeks of moving through the network, Chuck's group reached the foothills of the Pyrenees. The final stage was the most physically demanding, crossing the mountains into Spain on foot in winter conditions. The guide, a Basque smuggler who knew the mountain passes, was matter-of-fact about the risks. Exposure could kill you faster than Germans. Altitude sickness affected some people severely, and German border patrols did operate in the lower passes. They'd be traveling at night through snow, following trails that existed only in the guide's memory. The crossing took 3 nights of brutal hiking. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Several of the men suffered from altitude sickness, vomiting and disoriented but forced to keep moving. Chuck's physical conditioning from his West Virginia upbringing served him well. He was used to rough terrain, cold conditions, pushing through discomfort. On the 3rd night, the guide stopped and pointed down at lights in a valley. España, he said simply. Spain, neutral territory. They descended at dawn and were immediately detained by Spanish authorities, standard procedure for illegal border crossers. But Spain, though officially neutral, had an understanding with the Allies. After brief internment and paperwork, Allied military personnel were quietly transferred to British authorities in Gibraltar. Chuck Yeager, dead for 6 weeks, was alive in Allied territory. Gibraltar, April 1944. Chuck reported to the Allied military authorities, expecting a debriefing followed by transport back to England and return to his squadron. The debrief went as expected. Detailed questions about his shoot-down evasion route, resistance contacts. He provided only minimal information to protect them. German troop movements he'd observed. Anything of intelligence value. Then came the part he didn't expect. A senior officer reviewed his file and delivered the verdict matter-of-factly. "You're done flying combat in the European theater, Sergeant. You'll be reassigned to training duties in the United States. Transportation will be arranged." Chuck thought he'd misheard. "Sir, I need to get back to my squadron. They're short on pilots." The officer's expression suggested he'd had this conversation before. "The regulation is clear. Any pilot who evades through occupied territory and has contact with resistance networks cannot return to combat over Europe. You know too much about escape lines, safe houses, and resistance personnel. If you're shot down again and captured, the Germans will interrogate you. Torture is standard procedure for extracting information about resistance networks." The logic was coldly practical. One pilot wasn't worth compromising escape networks that had saved hundreds of Allied airmen and would save hundreds more. If Chuck returned to combat and was captured, his knowledge, even if he tried to resist interrogation, could unravel entire networks, leading to the execution of dozens or hundreds of French civilians. The rule existed for good reason, but Chuck hadn't survived occupied France and crossed the Pyrenees in winter to be grounded. "With respect, sir, I'll take that risk. Send me back to my squadron." "It's not your risk to take, Sergeant. It's a risk to every resistance member who helped you and everyone in those networks. The decision is final." Chuck was processed through the system, medical examination, new uniforms to replace the worn clothes he'd been wearing, orders for transport to England and then back to the United States. Within 72 hours, he was supposed to be on a ship heading home. He spent those 72 hours planning how to circumvent the order. The military bureaucracy in wartime was massive and often chaotic. Units moved constantly. Personnel records were scattered across multiple commands, orders could be delayed or lost in the shuffle. Chuck understood that if he could get back to his squadron at Leaston before the reassignment orders caught up with him, he might be able to fly under the radar long enough to make his case. He showed up at the Air Transport Command requesting space on any flight heading toward England. The clerk barely looked at his papers. Just another pilot returning from medical leave or reassignment, nothing unusual. Chuck was manifested on a transport flight departing that afternoon. By the time his reassignment orders caught up with the system, he was already landing at an airfield in England, hitching a ride to Leaston, and walking into the 357th Fighter Group Operations Building. His squadron mates reacted like they'd seen a ghost, which in a sense they had. Chuck Yeager had been listed as MIA, presumed dead, for 6 weeks. Now he was standing in front of them, very much alive, with no official explanation for his presence. His squadron commander faced an interesting dilemma. Regulations clearly stated that evaders couldn't return to combat, but those regulations also took time to process through channels, and the 357th was chronically short of experienced pilots. Chuck had 7 combat missions under his belt and 1 confirmed kill before being shot down. Hardly an ace, but experienced enough to be valuable. "You're not supposed to be here, Yeager." "I know, sir. But I am here, and you need pilots." The commander considered this. "If I put you back on the flight roster, we're both violating direct orders. When someone higher up notices, it's going to be a problem." "Yes, sir, but in the meantime I can fly missions." The calculation was pragmatic more than principled. The commander needed pilots. Chuck wanted to fly. The consequences of bending regulations seemed distant compared to the immediate needs of combat operations. "You didn't hear this from me, but I'm not going to look too closely at the roster for the next few days. If your name happens to appear on flight assignments, I'll be too busy with operational matters to notice. Clear?" "Clear, sir." Chuck flew his next combat mission 3 days later. The bureaucratic fiction lasted exactly 2 weeks. Chuck flew multiple missions, his name appearing on rosters under circumstances that suggested he'd never left the squadron. Then someone at higher headquarters noticed that a pilot who was supposed to be in the United States was flying combat missions over Germany. The order came down. Ground Sergeant Yeager immediately. Report to 8th Air Force Headquarters for disciplinary proceedings. Chuck's squadron commander stalled, claimed communications difficulties, bought time. But the situation was unsustainable. Either Chuck would be formally grounded and court-martialed for insubordination, or someone with sufficient authority needed to waive the regulation. That someone turned out to be General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The case reached Eisenhower's desk through the chain of command. Pilot violates regulations by returning to combat after evasion. Squadron commander complicit. Situation requires resolution. Eisenhower could enforce the regulation as written, or he could recognize that regulations sometimes conflict with practical necessities. Eisenhower was planning the D-Day invasion, scheduled for early June. He needed every experienced pilot available. He also understood that morale mattered, that other pilots were watching how the system treated someone who'd evaded successfully and wanted to keep fighting. The waiver was granted with conditions. Chuck could return to combat operations, but only if he promised that if shot down again over occupied Europe, he would take immediate measures to avoid capture. Translation: suicide was preferable to interrogation that might compromise resistance networks. Chuck agreed without hesitation. He'd made it back once. He wouldn't get shot down again. May 1944. Chuck returned to full combat status, flying bomber escort missions deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous despite increasing Allied air superiority. German pilots were experienced, their aircraft capable, and they fought with the desperation of people defending their homeland. Chuck's combat record through May was solid but unspectacular. Regular missions, a few engagements, good shooting, but no additional kills. He was a competent fighter pilot, reliable in formation, aggressive when opportunity presented. October 12, 1944. Everything changed. The mission was another bomber escort, B-17s attacking industrial targets around Bremen. The 357th Fighter Group was flying high cover, positioned above and ahead of the bomber stream to intercept any German fighters before they could reach the bombers. German fighters appeared in force, Bf-109s and Fw-190s, diving from altitude in the classic Luftwaffe tactic of striking fast and disengaging before escorts could react. Chuck's flight engaged and the sky dissolved into the chaos that characterized dogfighting. Aircraft turning hard, altitudes changing rapidly, tracers streaking through the air, radio discipline breaking down as everyone called targets simultaneously. Chuck got position on a Bf-109, fired a burst that hit the cockpit and engine. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and fell away, trailing smoke. First kill of the day. He reversed hard, gained altitude, spotted another Bf-109 engaging a P-51 from his squadron. Chuck dove, closed rapidly, fired from deflection angle. Hits along the fuselage and wing root. The 109 broke off, smoking heavily. Second kill. The engagement continued for 20 minutes, an eternity in combat time. Chuck maneuvered through the furball, his exceptional eyesight letting him spot opportunities others missed. His instinctive flying ability letting him position his aircraft perfectly for shooting solutions. Third kill, Fw-190, caught in a climbing turn. Vulnerable, hit in the engine cowling. Fourth kill, another Bf-109, this one trying to escape to cloud cover. Chuck caught it before it reached safety. Fifth kill, Fw-190 diving away toward the deck. Chuck followed, pulled lead, fired, and watched the German fighter auger into the ground. When the engagement broke off, the surviving Luftwaffe fighters disengaging, low on ammunition and fuel, Chuck climbed back to altitude and took stock. His Mustang had taken some hits but remained flyable. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, and unless he'd miscounted, he'd just shot down 5 German aircraft in a single mission. The gun camera footage would confirm it later, but Chuck knew immediately he'd just done something rare. 5 kills in one day made you an instant ace. Most fighter pilots never achieved ace status. Those who did usually accumulated kills over dozens of missions, not in a single afternoon. Chuck Yeager, who'd been dead 6 months earlier, had just become one of the few pilots in the war to achieve ace status in a single mission. But the truly unusual part wasn't achieving ace status once. It was that he'd already been an ace before being shot down in March. When his first kill was confirmed back in March, Chuck had already had 4 victories from previous missions that he hadn't had time to document before being shot down. The bureaucracy had lost track of those earlier kills during his MIA period. Now with 5 more confirmed kills, he'd become an ace for the second time. 2 separate ace qualifications, same pilot, same war. The only fighter pilot in World War II to achieve that particular distinction. By November 1944, the air war over Europe had shifted dramatically in the Allies' favor. The Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots faster than training could replace them. Fuel shortages limited flying hours. Allied bombing had disrupted aircraft production. German airspace belonged increasingly to American and British aircraft. But the Luftwaffe had one technological advantage that threatened to change the equation: the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me-262 was revolutionary. Twin jet engines gave it a top speed of 540 mph, nearly 100 mph faster than the P-51 Mustang, which could manage about 440 mph at optimal altitude. German pilots flying Me-262s could dictate engagement terms: attack at will, disengage when convenient, operate with near impunity against prop-driven fighters. Allied pilots had strict orders regarding Me-262 encounters. Don't engage in direct combat. The jet's speed advantage was overwhelming. Instead, try to catch them during takeoff or landing when they were slower and more vulnerable. Even then, the engagements were dangerous. Chuck had heard stories about the Me-262 but hadn't encountered one personally. That changed on November 6, 1944. The 357th Fighter Group was flying patrol over the Hanover region when Chuck spotted something unusual: an aircraft moving faster than anything propeller-driven, leaving twin-engine contrails maneuvering with the loose, confident pattern of a pilot who knew he was untouchable. Me-262, standard protocol: don't engage. Report position. Let higher altitude fighters attempt an intercept. But Chuck's tactical instincts were calculating angles and energy states. The jet was fast in level flight or climbing. But it wasn't infinitely fast. And it had vulnerabilities. The early jet engines took time to spool up from idle to full power, unlike piston engines that could respond almost instantly to throttle inputs. That meant Me-262s had to be careful about bleeding off too much speed in maneuvering, because regaining that speed took time. Chuck watched the jet's pattern. The pilot was being aggressive, making tight turns to position on P-51s, confident his speed would let him escape if they tried to counter. But tight turns bleed energy. Physics doesn't care about propulsion type. Chuck positioned himself not behind the jet. He'd never catch it in a tail chase, but anticipating where it would be after its next maneuvering sequence. He climbed to gain altitude, trading speed for position, watching the Me-262 continue its attack pattern. The jet pilot saw targets below and dove to attack, building speed, then reversed hard to avoid return fire from the P-51's wingman. That reversal cost energy, speed converted to turning radius. Chuck rolled inverted and dove from above, not chasing where the jet was but leading where it would be. The geometry aligned perfectly. Chuck diving from altitude, building speed, the Me-262 coming out of its turn momentarily slower, engines still spooling up to regain energy. For about 3 seconds, Chuck's Mustang, traveling downhill, gravity-assisted, had a firing solution on the jet. He fired a long burst, lead computing perfectly, watching his tracers walk into the Me-262's fuselage. Hits sparkled along the jet's body. Something critical failed. Fuel lines, hydraulics, structural damage. The Me-262 began trailing smoke, lost control authority, and fell away toward the deck. Chuck pulled out of his dive, overspeed warning screaming, G-forces crushing him into his seat. When he leveled out and looked back, the Me-262 was gone, crashed into the German countryside below. Gun camera footage confirmed what seemed impossible. A P-51 Mustang had shot down a Me-262 jet fighter in air-to-air combat. It was the first confirmed jet kill by the 357th Fighter Group and one of only a handful of jets shot down in direct combat rather than caught during vulnerable takeoff landing phases. The tactical analysis was studied extensively. Chuck hadn't outrun the jet or outmaneuvered it in any conventional sense. He'd predicted its behavior, positioned himself perfectly, and exploited a 3-second vulnerability window that most pilots wouldn't have recognized existed. The kill demonstrated something beyond technical flying skill or good shooting. It showed the kind of tactical thinking that separated exceptional pilots from merely competent ones. Understanding not just how to fly your aircraft, but how to exploit the specific limitations of your opponent's aircraft within the constraints of physics and energy management. German pilots flying Me-262s had technological superiority, but technology isn't everything. Tactics, timing, and situation awareness still mattered. Chuck Yeager, West Virginia boy with 8th grade education, had just proven that point definitively. Between November 1944 and January 1945, Chuck flew continuously, compiling one of the most impressive combat records of the war. His final tally, 11.5 confirmed aerial victories. The half credit came from a shared kill where multiple pilots contributed to downing a single enemy aircraft, plus 2 additional aircraft destroyed on the ground during strafing runs. But the numbers tell only part of the story. Chuck had become a flight leader, responsible for training newer pilots, teaching them the tactics that kept you alive. He passed along lessons learned through experience. Maintain situational awareness, manage your energy state. Don't fixate on a single target, trust your wingman. Know when to disengage. The younger pilots watched him carefully, trying to understand what made him different. His aircraft handling was smooth but not showy. His shooting was accurate but not superhuman. Gun camera footage showed he missed plenty. What distinguished him was consistency and judgment. He made fewer mistakes, recognized dangerous situations earlier, exploited opportunities faster. One pilot who flew as Chuck's wingman described it. Yeager had this ability to process everything happening around him while still flying his own aircraft perfectly. He'd call out threats I hadn't seen yet, identify aircraft types at distances where I could barely tell they were aircraft, and position himself exactly where he needed to be without seeming to think about it. It was like he had 5 seconds more time than everyone else to make decisions. The final months of the war saw the Luftwaffe collapsing. Fuel shortages grounded much of the German fighter force. Experienced pilots were dead or reassigned to training duties. The quality of opposition declined noticeably. Chuck encountered German pilots who made basic tactical errors, suggesting minimal training. But dangerous missions continued. Ground attack sorties against German airfields, rail yards, and supply convoys put pilots at risk from intense anti-aircraft fire. Flak killed more Allied pilots in the final months than air combat did. Every mission deep into Germany meant flying through curtains of exploding shells, each one capable of destroying an aircraft instantly. Chuck flew his final combat mission in January 1945. By then, the outcome of the war was inevitable. The question wasn't if Germany would be defeated, but how much longer the fighting would continue. Allied forces were advancing from both east and west. German cities were being systematically destroyed by strategic bombing. The Third Reich was collapsing. Chuck's war ended not with dramatic dogfights, but with administrative orders. Experienced pilots were being rotated home for rest, reassignment, or discharge. He'd completed his tour, survived when most expected him to die, and compiled a combat record that would become legendary. When he departed England for the United States in February 1945, he left as one of the most successful fighter pilots of the war. But he wasn't thinking about legacy or historical significance. He was thinking about Glennis, about home, about whether he'd ever fly again without someone shooting at him. The answer to that last question would prove more complicated than he expected. August 1945. Chuck Yeager returned to the United States as the war ended, expecting discharge and return to civilian life. He was 22 years old with an 8th-grade education and skills that translated poorly to peacetime employment, excellent at shooting, flying, and staying alive in combat situations. The Army Air Forces was demobilizing rapidly, releasing millions of servicemen back to civilian life. But they were also planning for the future. The war had accelerated aviation technology dramatically: jet engines, rocket propulsion, advanced aerodynamics, materials science. The military needed pilots to test these new technologies, to push aircraft to their limits, to determine what was possible. They offered Chuck a position at Wright Field in Ohio as a test pilot. Test flying in 1945 was less systematic than modern flight testing. There were no simulators to practice emergencies, limited understanding of high-speed aerodynamics, minimal safety protocols. Test pilots flew experimental aircraft, pushed them to their limits, and hoped to survive when something went wrong. The mortality rate was high enough that the work was considered more dangerous than combat flying. Chuck accepted immediately. Wright Field introduced him to a different kind of flying. Combat flying was about tactics, situational awareness, and outmaneuvering opponents. Test flying was about precision, data collection, and systematically exploring an aircraft's performance envelope. You didn't react instinctively. You followed test cards, recorded specific data points, repeated maneuvers exactly to ensure consistent results. Chuck's mechanical aptitude and engineering intuition proved valuable. He understood aircraft systems deeply enough to diagnose problems, to feel when something was operating outside normal parameters, to provide feedback that engineers could use to improve designs. One engineer who worked with him noted, Yeager couldn't do the mathematical calculations that degreed engineers did, but he had an intuitive understanding of what was happening with the aircraft that was often more valuable. He could describe exactly how control forces changed at different speeds, how the aircraft's behavior shifted near stall, details that informed our theoretical models. In 1947, Chuck transferred to Muroc Army Airfield in California, later renamed Edwards Air Force Base, where the military conducted its most advanced flight testing. The high desert location offered long runways, clear weather, and isolation from populated areas, ideal for testing experimental aircraft that had a tendency to crash. Among the projects at Muroc was one that seemed particularly insane, an attempt to fly faster than sound. The sound barrier wasn't just a technical challenge. It was a theoretical wall that many aerodynamicists believed might be insurmountable. As aircraft approached the speed of sound, around 662 mph at sea level, they encountered severe aerodynamic phenomena: shock waves forming on the aircraft, control surfaces losing effectiveness, violent buffeting that could break the airframe apart. Several pilots had died trying to reach supersonic speeds. Aircraft had literally disintegrated at high subsonic velocities. Some theorists argued that the sound barrier represented a fundamental limit on aircraft performance, that the aerodynamic forces at transonic speeds would always destroy any aircraft attempting to break through. The Bell X-1 was designed specifically to challenge that assumption. It was shaped like a .50 caliber bullet, a shape known to be stable at supersonic velocities. Powered by a liquid-fueled rocket engine, it would be carried to altitude under a B-29 bomber, released and then accelerate under its own power. The Air Force needed a pilot willing to fly it into the unknown velocity regime, where aerodynamic theory suggested the aircraft might simply disintegrate. Chuck volunteered. The flight test program was methodical, incremental speed increases, gathering data at each velocity, ensuring the aircraft remained controllable. By October 1947, Chuck had flown the X-1 to Mach 0.94, 94% of the speed of sound. The aircraft encountered severe buffeting at that velocity, but remained controllable. The final attempt was scheduled for October 14, 1947. 2 days before the flight, Chuck was horseback riding with Glennis. They'd married in 1945, and injured himself falling off the horse. He cracked 2 ribs. The injury was painful enough that he couldn't close the X-1's side hatch with his right arm. Standard procedure would be to postpone the flight until he recovered, but Chuck didn't report the injury. Instead, he enlisted a fellow pilot to help devise a workaround, a broomstick handle that he could use as a lever to close the hatch with his left arm, compensating for the injured right side. October 14, 1947, 10 a.m. The B-29 carried the X-1 to 20,000 feet. Chuck climbed down into the X-1's cramped cockpit, used his broomstick lever to close the hatch, and signaled ready for drop. The B-29 released the X-1. Chuck fired the rocket engine and began accelerating. The flight plan called for reaching Mach 0.97, gathering data, and returning. But as Chuck climbed and accelerated, the X-1's behavior remained stable. The severe buffeting that had characterized earlier flights actually decreased as he approached Mach 1. The shock waves that had caused control problems were moving aft on the aircraft. Aerodynamic effectiveness was returning. Chuck made a decision: keep accelerating. At approximately 43,000 feet, traveling at roughly 700 mph, the X-1's machmeter, the instrument measuring speed relative to sound, jumped abruptly. The needle hit 1.06, indicating the aircraft was traveling faster than sound. The flight was smooth. No buffeting, no violent forces, no structural failure. Chuck Yeager had just become the first human to fly faster than the speed of sound in controlled level flight. The sonic boom created by the X-1 swept across the desert floor, the first man-made sonic boom ever heard on Earth. Ground observers heard the distinctive double crack and knew immediately that history had been made. Chuck's radio transmission was characteristically understated. "Say, Ridley, make another note, will ya? There's something wrong with this old machmeter. It's gone kinda screwy on me." Jack Ridley, the flight engineer monitoring from the ground, understood immediately. "If it is, we'll fix it. Personally, I think you're seeing things." "Yeah, I guess I am, Jack. I'm seeing Mach 1.06. The sound barrier, the theoretical wall that couldn't be breached, had been broken. Not through revolutionary new theories or massive technological breakthroughs, but through incremental testing, careful engineering, and a pilot willing to push into the unknown. The achievement remained classified for 8 months. The Air Force didn't announce it publicly until June 1948, concerned about Soviet intelligence learning details of the X-1's design and performance. When the news finally broke, Chuck became instantly famous. But the achievement's significance went beyond setting a speed record. Breaking the sound barrier proved that supersonic flight was possible, that the transonic region could be traversed safely, that aircraft design could overcome the aerodynamic challenges of high-speed flight. It opened the door to everything that followed: supersonic fighters, rockets to space, commercial supersonic transport. Every aircraft that flew faster than sound, every spacecraft that returned from orbit, every hypersonic vehicle, all descended technically from what Chuck proved possible that morning over the Mojave Desert. The West Virginia boy with 8th grade education had just changed the course of aviation history. Breaking the sound barrier made Chuck Yeager famous, but he continued test flying for decades afterward. Fame was interesting, but flying was what he actually cared about. Through the 1950s and 1960s, he tested increasingly advanced aircraft, early jet fighters, experimental designs, aircraft pushing ever higher speeds and altitudes. Each generation of aircraft brought new challenges, new limits to explore, new ways to die if you made mistakes. He set multiple speed and altitude records. He commanded the Air Force Aerospace Research Pilot School, training the next generation of test pilots, many of whom would become astronauts. He flew over 360 different types of aircraft during his career, everything from captured German designs to cutting-edge American prototypes. One aircraft nearly killed him. On December 10, 1963, Chuck was flying an NF-104 Starfighter, a modified F-104 with a rocket engine designed to reach extreme altitudes for astronaut training. At 104,000 feet, the aircraft entered an uncontrollable spin. Chuck fought the controls for nearly 20,000 feet of altitude loss before finally ejecting. The ejection itself was violent. The rocket seat fired, but the aircraft was tumbling, and Chuck's helmet struck the seat's headrest, cracking his faceplate. Then the seat's emergency oxygen system malfunctioned, releasing pure oxygen that immediately ignited from the heat of atmospheric friction during his descent. His face and hands were burned before the parachute deployed, and he could remove the helmet. He was 40 years old, severely burned, and had just survived a crash that would have killed most pilots. He was hospitalized for weeks, underwent skin grafts, and was told his flight testing career was probably over. He was flying again within months, burns healed, determined to continue despite the advice of doctors who suggested retirement. This pattern characterized Chuck's approach to flying. Recognize risks, calculate odds, accept consequences, and keep pushing forward. It was the same mentality that had made him survive over occupied France, volunteer to return to combat against regulations, and push the X-1 past its planned test envelope. Chuck flew combat missions in Vietnam, commanding fighter squadrons and personally leading missions despite being senior enough to stay safely behind a desk. He wasn't there because orders required it. He was there because fighter pilots belong in fighters, and wars are where that matters. His Vietnam service was less documented than his WA2 record, partly because the war itself was controversial, partly because Chuck was no longer the young rising star, but an established legend doing what he'd always done: flying combat missions. He retired from the Air Force in 1975 as a brigadier general after 34 years of service. The 8th grade education that had once limited his options had been overcome through competence, courage, and consistent performance. He'd risen through the ranks through demonstrated ability rather than credentials, proving that merit sometimes matters more than diplomas. Post-retirement, Chuck continued flying privately, consulting on aviation projects and maintaining his pilot skills well into his 70s and 80s. He flew chase aircraft for the 50th anniversary recreation of his sound barrier flight in 1997, piloting an F-15 at age 74. He wrote an autobiography, Yeager, an autobiography published in 1985, that became a bestseller and introduced his story to generations who hadn't lived through World War II or the early space age. The book was characteristically direct. Chuck didn't romanticize war, didn't claim superhuman abilities, and described both his successes and mistakes with equal honesty. Tom Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, published in 1979, and the subsequent 1983 film, cemented Chuck's place in American cultural mythology. The film depicted him as the epitome of the fearless test pilot, the standard against which astronauts were measured, the embodiment of courage and competence. Chuck was ambivalent about the portrayal. He appreciated the recognition but disliked being turned into a symbol rather than being understood as a person who'd simply done his job to the best of his ability. What do we make of Chuck Yeager's story? What lessons transfer from his specific circumstances to broader human experience? The obvious narrative is pure inspiration. Small-town boy overcomes limited education and modest circumstances to achieve historic accomplishments through talent, determination, and courage. It's a satisfying story because it suggests that potential isn't constrained by origin, that abilities matter more than credentials, that individuals can exceed expectations through will and work. But Chuck's story is more complex than simple inspiration. His success required specific circumstances that can't be replicated. A world war that created opportunities for rapid advancement, military institutions willing to recognize talent regardless of educational background, technologies at development stages where individual pilot skill significantly impacted outcomes, and frankly, significant luck in surviving situations that killed many equally talented pilots. The pilots who died, shot down over Germany, killed in test aircraft crashes, lost in training accidents, weren't less skilled or less courageous than Chuck. They were equally capable people who encountered slightly different circumstances, made fractionally different decisions, or simply had worse luck. Chuck acknowledged this directly. "I've known a lot of guys who were better pilots than me. Some of them died in training before they ever got to combat. Some got shot down on their first mission. Some pushed an experimental aircraft one test point too far. The difference between me and them wasn't talent. It was luck and timing." Yet acknowledging the role of luck doesn't diminish the achievement. Chuck did shoot down 11.5 enemy aircraft. He did evade capture and return to combat. He did break the sound barrier. These accomplishments required specific skills, sustained courage, and consistent performance under conditions where mistakes were fatal. What transfers to contexts beyond fighter aircraft? First, the value of domain expertise combined with intuition. Chuck's formal education was minimal, but his understanding of aircraft and flying was profound. He combined mechanical knowledge, physical skill, and situational awareness in ways that couldn't be reduced to checklists or procedures. In any complex field, medicine, business, engineering, art, there's a difference between competent performance and exceptional mastery that involves intuition built from experience. Second, the importance of continuing forward after setbacks. Chuck was shot down, evaded through occupied territory, faced regulations that should have ended his combat career, survived burns that should have ended his test flying, and consistently chose to continue rather than accept comfortable alternatives. Not everyone should make those choices. Sometimes accepting limitations is wisdom rather than weakness. But Chuck's trajectory demonstrates that barriers aren't always as absolute as they appear. Third, the relationship between confidence and competence. Chuck wasn't arrogant in the sense of claiming abilities he didn't possess. He was confident in the specific sense of trusting his preparation, judgment, and skills in high-stakes situations. That confidence was earned through performance, not assumed through status. Fourth, the willingness to operate in uncertainty. Breaking the sound barrier meant flying into velocity regimes where aerodynamic theory suggested the aircraft might disintegrate. Combat flying meant encountering situations with incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. Test flying meant exploring aircraft behavior at the edges of their performance envelopes. Chuck operated comfortably in conditions that paralyzed people who needed certainty before acting. Finally, the importance of understanding systems deeply enough to exploit them. Chuck shot down an Me-262 jet fighter because he understood energy management, tactical geometry, and aircraft limitations well enough to recognize a 3-second vulnerability window. He broke the sound barrier partly because he understood the X-1 systems deeply enough to recognize when it was safe to exceed planned test parameters. These qualities, expertise, persistence, earned confidence, comfort with uncertainty, deep systemic understanding, appear across domains. They're not specific to fighter aircraft or test flying. They're general capabilities that produce exceptional performance in any complex field. But they're also not sufficient by themselves. Chuck operated in contexts where these capabilities mattered, where institutions recognized and rewarded them, where opportunities existed to demonstrate them. Talent without opportunity is tragedy. Chuck had both. Chuck Yeager lived to be 97 years old, dying December 7, 2020, Pearl Harbor Day, appropriately enough for someone whose military career began with that attack. He remained active almost to the end, flying privately, consulting on aviation projects, making public appearances, maintaining connections with military aviation communities. He embraced social media late in life, his Twitter account providing characteristically blunt commentary on aviation matters and occasional life advice delivered in the direct style that had characterized his entire life. His final tweet posted shortly before his death was simple: "For Victoria Yeager 11. It is profound sorrow. I must tell you that my life-love General Chuck Yeager passed just before 9 p.m. ET. An incredible life well lived, America's greatest pilot, and a legacy of strength, adventure, and patriotism will be remembered forever." The responses flooded in from around the world: pilots, engineers, aviation enthusiasts, military personnel, people who'd never met him but understood what he represented. The outpouring revealed how Chuck had become larger than his specific accomplishments. He'd become a symbol of American aviation achievement, of pushing beyond perceived limits, of the post-World War II era, when it seemed like anything was possible if you had enough courage and skill. But symbols are reductions. They simplify complex people into representative stories. Chuck Yeager was more complicated than the symbol, difficult at times, blunt to the point of rudeness, dismissive of people he considered incompetent, unapologetic about his opinions. He wasn't a perfect hero from central casting. He was a real person with rough edges, strong opinions, and a complicated personality. That's perhaps the most important aspect of his legacy. He achieved extraordinary things while remaining human, flawed, and real. The accomplishments weren't the product of superhuman abilities or Hollywood-perfect character. They came from a regular person with specific talents, who found contexts where those talents mattered, and who had the courage to push forward consistently. In October 1944, Chuck Yeager sat in a French farmhouse recently escaped from occupied territory, officially dead according to military records. 6 months later, he'd become an ace twice, and shot down a German jet fighter with a propeller-driven aircraft. 3 years after that, he'd broken the sound barrier and changed aviation history. The trajectory from dead pilot to legend wasn't inevitable. Hundreds of equally talented pilots died in combat, were captured as POWs, or simply completed their tours and returned to obscurity. Chuck's story required talent, certainly, but also extraordinary luck. Specific historical circumstances, institutional flexibility, and consistent choices to push forward rather than accept comfortable alternatives. What makes his story compelling isn't just the accomplishments, though those are remarkable enough, but the pattern they reveal about human potential under extreme conditions. War is humanity's worst behavior, organized violence at industrial scale, morally indefensible in countless ways. But it's also a laboratory for understanding human performance under maximum stress. Combat flying demanded split-second decisions, physical courage, sustained concentration, and the ability to function effectively while terrified. It revealed capacities that peacetime circumstances rarely test. Chuck demonstrated those capacities repeatedly, surviving after being shot down when survival seemed impossible, returning to combat when regulations prohibited it, achieving ace status twice, shooting down a technologically superior jet fighter, breaking the sound barrier despite believing the attempt might kill him. But he also demonstrated something else, that exceptional performance doesn't require exceptional origins. West Virginia coal country, 8th grade education, mechanic background, these weren't advantages. They were obstacles he overcame through ability and opportunity. The American military in World War II created paths for people like Chuck to demonstrate competence regardless of credentials. The Flying Sergeant program recognized that educational background didn't necessarily predict flying ability. Commanders willing to bend regulations allowed talent to override bureaucracy. The test pilot program valued demonstrated capability over formal degrees. Modern institutions often lose this flexibility. Credentials, degrees, established paths, these become gatekeepers that exclude talented people from opportunities where they might excel. Chuck's story is a reminder that potential doesn't always present itself with the correct paperwork. But it's also a reminder that individual achievement occurs within institutional contexts. Chuck couldn't have broken the sound barrier without the Air Force, Bell Aircraft, NACA engineers, and hundreds of support personnel who made the X-1 program possible. His combat success depended on aircraft mechanics, intelligence officers, logistics personnel, and countless others whose contributions enabled pilots to fly. Stories of individual achievement often erase these collaborative contexts, suggesting lone heroes accomplish everything independently. Chuck knew better. He repeatedly credited the people who made his achievements possible. French resistance members who risked their lives, squadron commanders who bent regulations, engineers who designed aircraft he tested, crew chiefs who maintained his planes. The right way to understand Chuck Yeager isn't as a superhuman individual, but as an exceptionally capable person who found contexts where his specific abilities mattered, who had the courage to exploit opportunities, and who benefited from both luck and the support of many others. That's the real legacy. Not that one man was special, but that under the right circumstances, with the right opportunities, human beings can accomplish things that seem impossible. That limitations aren't always as absolute as they appear. That courage and competence can overcome obstacles. That potential exists in unexpected places, waiting for opportunities to manifest. He was a West Virginia boy who learned to fly, got shot down, refused to stay dead, and then spent the rest of his life proving that the impossible is just what nobody's figured out how to do yet. That's his story. That's his war. That's his legacy. And it started with a decision to eject from a burning aircraft over occupied France, survive in enemy territory, and refuse to accept that his war was over. Sometimes the difference between possible and impossible is just someone too stubborn to accept the distinction.